Listen, long are this stone's stories, how these things came to be, how they could be yet, how they used to be in Yerdagum, which is an old word which means the old days. There are tales that tend to cycle, coiled round Midden Yard. Earth's every speck sires stories. Each emergent story parents a place. The tales tell a site its significance. The site gives the tale a tale. Folkestone's name fastens stone to folk, and its folk fastens stories to its stones. Listen, Ainsworth, Eadbald's daughter, she shaped herself a long-lived legend that lives here. She mothered myth here. Is that making sense? So stories, you must realise, they're not just oral or literate. Stories are geographic. There are stories that split like river deltas. There are stories that dam up and change the landscape. There's the kind of story that tells you where you are. Then there's the occasional story which flows upstream, sends something back, a standing wave in the flow. And I think this has ended up being one of those stories. It began with a boat, a wave beater over the Whale Road it came, delivering descendants and kings to Kent, Folkestone's forebears. Eansworth's parents were Jutish gentrifiers, because some stories cycle. And Eansworth's story made Folkestone. It's still making Folkestone. You've probably heard the story, or if you haven't, just hang around 10 minutes and someone will tell you, that's just the way it is in Folkestone, that Eansworth, she was the daughter of the King of Kent, but she wasn't about that political life. They wanted to marry her off to some other king. But she chose, which is unusual for someone sort of as the firstborn. Maybe like when you're the third, fourth, it would be more normal. But for her, she decided she's going to go into the ministry. So she gets religion, starts a priory here in Folkestone. Kind of just does away with what's expected of her. And you've got to realise, though, when we think about priories, we might be thinking about like prayers and vespers and stuff like that. But in this time, it's a centre of learning amongst a pre-literate culture. So this is someone who is building and leading a community without any thought of what's expected of a person like her or a place like this. Even better than that, of course, is Eansworth is magic. The historical Eansworth, she's ascended to story, she's ascended to sainthood. So we hear these tales of how she made water flow uphill to serve the priory, or how she brought a goose back to life from old bones. Amazing stories that live on in the town and kind of give us a sense of what this place is. Wild, strange stories that have kind of been upset by the recent discovery last year that the old bones in her reliquary might be the woman herself. Upsets the story, of course, because it reminds us that there's a real person in the middle of it. We remember a later invention and we forget the woman at the centre. And it's unlikely that we'll ever know more about the historical Eansworth. The evidence just isn't there, empirically so anyway. It's all moulded away into the earth beneath us, or been destroyed, overlaid by later invaders who slapped their name on their church at this cursory kind of imitation of continuity. But seeing as she is a figure with whom these stories have become associated, it stands to reason that she might appear to the pious, and that's kind of where my story starts, the idea of kind of searching for this myth to find something real within it. So my story starts with a boat, a wave beater to traverse the goal road. And here's what I figure. If I'm to uncover, rediscover, re-excavate, connect with the reality of Folkestone's stories and Folkestone's hidden myths, it kind of feels appropriate to search for that from the vantage point of the materia that defines it. It's water. So we have the sea, we have the harbour, we've got the pent stream that unseen runs beneath our feet but still dictates the shape of our community. And of course we have Eanswith Water, that famous back-running stream that brought water up to the Priory and Legislature sort of ended at the Bale Pond, even though the Bale Pond now is not much bigger than a bath, and we all know that it's fed by a pipe maintained by the council. We all know that. Anyway, if I'm to sort of seek to find Folkestone stories, approaching by water seems appropriate. So I got myself a boat and began exploring the waters around Folkestone, following rumours, following folk tales, this idea that keeps coming up that there are still hidden entrances to waterways and a network of water beneath the town. And I kind of thought it'd be really amazing if we could find some evidence of that, find something that we can connect to the stories and make them real. So before I went out, I started by sort of inspired by the Germanic art that came over with the Jutes, started painting this boat to kind of make a record of what I found as I went. Started off with these. There's some geese on the front. You can come up and look at this later. Because tails turn and entangle, or they can slip and sink. These geese gather and embrace the whole. Their necks wrought round so that as I sort of paddle and push, they reflect and remember the saint for which I search. So painted this first, and then I put out from the stones to the sea, paddled the perimeter, onward to outline Folkestone's folds, to define a discrete edge, end to end. But first time I went out, my boat was battered and rocked and rolled over. So into the water I went, and soaking, swam back to shore. A first failure, and Folkestone's secret still unsearched. And perhaps it was all pointless, and folk tales had made me a fool. Eanswith's energy perhaps too far faded. And maybe stories are only stories, tales are only tales. Perhaps forebears should be forgotten, and stones are only stones. And after that, I sort of sat on the shore and tried to envision Eanswith. See, what had happened was I tried to go out and find something, anything that would just sort of, I'm not sure what, but something that would illuminate something of what this town is. Or maybe I was hoping I'd just know it when I saw it. Maybe I was looking for a miracle after Eanswith, something like that. And instead I'd capsized in this plastic boat with geese painted on the front, and I had to reassess. But I began to think about maybe that's where it went wrong. It's kind of painting these geese and things, because I was trying to evoke a sense of Eanswith based on a story that had nothing to do with her, really. So when I started to look into it, this story of goose resurrection is attributed to female saints up and down the country, and it's not specific to her. And I began to think about what I needed was something specific to this 7th century princess turned community activist, something that's specific to a person we barely know anything about. But we do know that for all her devotion, her father took slightly longer to come round to the idea of Christianity. And he kind of flip-flopped quite a bit. It seemed to be mainly a political posturing that made him convert. And we know that the old ways died hard because you can see it in the artwork that survives from Kent around the time. There's these remnants of the old stories. We see it in the manuscripts that survive from the period that preserve an oral tradition that's even older than Eanswyth, that it would have been known to her. And it made me begin to think, like, what were her folk tales? What were the stories that gave her a sense of place? Because we hear a story about Eanswyth and automatically think, what does that say about us? So what were the things that, what were the stories she was looking to? What were the myths that gave her a sense of who she was, of identity, of a sense of place? And I began to think, like, along with these geese, I painted this icon of Eanswyth on the front here, like a little cameo of sorts. And it felt appropriate. It felt very Folkestone, because in Folkestone we've got parents that send their children to school with an image of Eanswyth on their jumpers over their hearts, and it's this little shimmering of memory, a little shimmering of myth. And so it just seemed like a good idea at the time. But for the second illumination, I went over here at the back where there are two boars, and that's a symbol of power and protection from the old country that would have been known to Eanswyth, that would have been taught to her by her father. So rather than being something that's about these stories that became connected to Eanswyth after her own time, this is something that she would have recognised that sprang from the culture that she was in. And it was something that would allow her to speak to me, as it were. And I set out again, this time with more success, at least in terms of staying dry. And so I began to search the perimeter and just sort of go out every couple of days from a different spot, around the harbour, the Warren, like all our beaches, all the way up to Sandgate pretty much. And I began to get this feeling that if there are secret caverns, if there is something, it's not going to be found by merely being stumbled upon, because otherwise we'd all know where they were and they wouldn't be secret. But maybe it would be found in the ritual of this search, of kind of going out over and over again, repeated action until it generates meaning, like a sacrament or something. And then after that, there was an occasion where I pushed out further to see. So I sort of saw this little speck on the horizon, and so started sort of following it. And after a while, got closer. It turns out it was a cormorant that was like just bobbing up and down, and I was like, okay, that's cool, and turned round, and then it was kind of only then I realised how far out I'd gone. And then sort of the panic starts to set in, because this boat is not designed to go that far out, and I'm not really, like, I am kissing the weight limit on this thing. So that I'm not designed to be in that boat. And the land had become like this squat line on the horizon, and couldn't really work out the features anymore. So I could see the land, but I couldn't tell which bit was Folkestone, what bit's home, and that was quite scary, kind of panic-inducing. And when I get panicky, I kind of talk to myself, start chatting to myself, and then so I turned to this bird and said, like, oh, don't suppose you know the way, in a kind of like abstract, like panic, don't know what I'm going to do. Weird thing was, it kind of took off and just like went a couple hundred yards, like over my head, but towards shore, and with nothing else to follow. I thought, I'll follow that. And it was like this really weird, calm experience of following this bird. Just went like a little bit further on, and eventually went back to shore and landed on a pole. And I came in like exactly where I'd gone out from, and it was really surreal and strange, and like it was weird, but it was, I mean, more than anything, it was scary. It was like, it was a proper touch and go for a minute. But I remember sort of feeling different about Folkestone then. Like coming, I'd never come from that direction before, and yet like so many stories of Folkestone start that way, and it was a very surreal experience. And this bird, you know, like cormorants, like they have their arms like half out, their wings like half out when they're like just sitting around. And I looked up this sort of, well, thank you. And then it seemed sort of like bow low, almost as if it understood and was like acknowledging that I'd thanked it. And it was really weird. And I was sitting on the beach and thinking, I was like below the church, where the church is now. I was thinking like, I did read once that the priory, St. Eansworth's priory, had to be moved a couple of times. You know, even before they built the church, because it just kept falling down. Like recessive cliff, flooding, that kind of thing. And it made me think, like, as we're sitting on the beach, like, is that somewhere where Eansworth would have walked, would have stood? And it's kind of a really strange thing to think about. But maybe the original priory wasn't there, maybe it's still somewhere up on the cliff, or maybe it's in that bit in between, that's all, you know, the bits like all trees and weeds and blocked off paths and fly tipping, like maybe it's in there, and that would be kind of cool. Yeah, it's just sort of Folkestone began to feel different. I don't know if that was the beginning of what I was searching for. Like, part of me still very much a pragmatist and realised that that was just a weird coincidence, but it felt strange. And also, I'd been obsessing so much over this project and over worrying about doing this thing and like trusting that something will happen with no real reason to trust that. And nothing was happening, and so it was kind of this little tiny thing I'd grab onto, and especially the guys at Folkestone Fringe had put a lot of trust in me to do a project, and nothing was happening. And it was, yeah, so I sort of was having weird dreams at that time, and the first time that I shared about this, I really thought twice before telling people, but now I've done it once, and it should be easier. It still feels odd, so don't judge me. When I tell you, I was having dreams of this bird after that, and in the dreams the bird spoke, and it spoke in the voice of Eansworth. And the bird told me that it is still here. Eansworth water is still here, can still be found beneath the ground, but that it lives and it moves. It doesn't stay in one place. And that sometimes it comes up and can be discovered, but I know what that sounds like, and I know that it's just a dream, and a dream is just another kind of story. So, like, you know, perspective and all things. But it did help me kind of keep going out in the boat and keep going through this process of repeated action, this ritual that otherwise was feeling increasingly like folly. It was more of a spiritual search in a sense, like an expression of this desire to connect with this myth. I don't know, like something that would turn into something if I just did it and kept doing it. But all I had was this story, and no matter what happened and no matter how I felt about it, I was really still no further on than someone who hears the stories of Folkestone for the first time, like whether that be Eansworth or it be the Rotunda or William Harvey or Dutch refugees, whatever it might be, any of those stories that kind of come and squat on the landscape and kind of inform the character of the town. It's all ephemeral, it all dissipates when you try to reach for it and examine it. And I began to wonder, like, maybe the character of Folkestone is only as deep as the memories of the people who remember its stories. And that, like, just kept going around. Like, the character of Folkestone is only as deep as the memories of the people who remember its stories. And I began to think, like, maybe a place doesn't have any character at all, And I had that question in my head the last time I went out in the boat. It was like a couple of times before we brought it here and it exhibited it, a couple of days before that, and thinking like, is this going to come into anything? But that's when it happened. So this wave came over the bow, and I was taken under. When I came up again, it was very dark and very quiet and very close. And there was this little light ahead, and there's just this sort of gentle movement toward this light, sort of ascending slightly. I know how it sounds, and I didn't die because I'm here talking to you. I know it sounds a bit like that, and I knew I wasn't dead. I knew that hadn't happened because I'm still wet and cold and in a boat. Like, I was still very much in my body, but still, like, I found myself in this like weird tunnel thing. Approaching it slightly as I got closer to it, and things started to open out a bit more. Could see a bit more around me. Like, it was. So it turns out it was an electric light, and I came out into this open space that weirdly I recognised. So most of you, I think, know that recently, like, started a job at Created Folkestone, kind of doing estate management type stuff. There's a lot of going down into basements and looking at like where water's coming in and worrying about it. But I had been in this basement before, and there wasn't that much water in it before. Like, this was weird. But it did mean that I knew where I was, and I'm a key holder, so I got out the boat and was able to kind of pull it up through the hatch and emerge onto Tontine Street, like quite near the top, quite close to where Folkestone Fringe's studio is, where we were storing the boat, which was convenient. But it was really strange, and then it's the thing, I'd found it. It was here. Ian's with water had come up for a moment, and it felt like well, what's left is like this. Stories can sustain us. They can confer character on a place or an idea or a person. But having heard a narrative is not the same as the ecstatic experience of living it. It's almost like some kind of revelation to move from a receiver of reports to a witness of the water and teller of tales. Water still flowing in Folkestone, magic and myth still living here.